we're looking to really talk about how trafficking and commercial exploitation intersects with the vulnerabilities present in the LGBTQIA+ community, and what these risk factors and what creates a high risk environment for commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking. We're choosing to do this because June is recognized as Pride Month, and it is a celebration of the lives who came before us and all of the freedoms that we have been able to secure so far. But while we should celebrate these victories and all of the ground we've gained, it would be an incredible oversight to ignore that, particularly for our members of our community of color and who are transgender. Our youth and young adults are incredibly vulnerable to exploitation and sex trafficking. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and talk about how we're going to process forward here. We're going to start by talking about the risk factors unique or disproportionately present among the LGBTQIA+ community and individuals that contribute to these higher levels of trafficking. We're going to start off by talking interpersonal, familial relationships, housing situations, and then kind of move into a systemic and institutional discussion. And then from there, what we want to talk about is gaps, failures in services currently available for the population, and how we, as an audience of policymakers, service providers, advocates, and just members of the general public who are both in the community or identify as allies, can take to reduce this disproportionate impact. So our panelists are interested in hearing your questions and comments. The best way we're going to go about this is by you using the chat feature. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions, and as kind of natural breaks in the conversation happen, I'll prompt the panelists to answer your questions. We'll do our best to get all of your questions, but I know we do have a limited amount of time, so we're going to kind of try and make sure that they're as tied into the topic as possible. So while we do know that exploitation and trafficking can and does happen to anyone, the research and practice has documented a variety of risk factors that increase the likelihood of victimization. Often, particularly with marginalized communities, an increase in the number of these risk factors increases the likelihood for victimization. As such, we're going to begin by discussing what are prevalent among LGBTQIA+ youth and young adults and what contributes to that disproportionate impact. We're going to begin by talking about the perspective of familial and housing factors, and then we're going to kind of move into questions about systemic and institutional factors. So starting off, both recent research and data from the Open Doors Outreach Network indicates that a history of running away from home is one of the primary predictive risk factors for exploitation, with survivors being 5 times more likely to have a history of running away than non-trafficked individuals. So in your experience with working with LGBTQIA+ youth and young adults, can you talk about the ways this relates to those individuals, particularly those who have an unsupportive family or unsupportive relationships? Taylor, I want to start with you and your perspective about this through both your work with FCASV and the work that Capital T is doing in the Big Bend region.
Sure, awesome. So, like I said, I worked for the past 10 years, or for 10 years with folks who are experiencing homelessness with youth, and then continuing that work now with Capital T. And one of the things that always is clear is that youth are running away from something or they're running to something. And sometimes that's running away from an abusive or unsupportive household. That could be family rejection and being kicked out of the house. And then it could also be running to trying to find community that matches and validates who they are. But whatever the reason is for why a youth may find themselves on the street, we know that 1 in 3 youth have the likelihood of being approached by a trafficker within the first 48 hours of hitting the streets, because they start to be hungry, they run out of their supplies, their options are getting thinner and thinner. And so that makes them more likely for someone who will speak to validating them, if it is a trafficker, to pick them up and be that first person. So it's a lot of, is your community going to support a youth once they hit the streets? And is there someone who can intervene, like an outreach worker or a case manager who is safe and affirming, that can be that safe place to land until we can figure out what's going on at home? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you so much for that insight. 1 in 3 is a huge number, and I think that's a really scary kind of concept to think about. Mikayla or John, did you have any kind of additions to that or anything you wanted to add there?
I would just note, some of the research, particularly when you talk about the LGBTQ plus representation among the youth homelessness population, I think it's almost half of LGBTQ youth have run away from home because of family rejection, 43% because parents forced them out, and 32% to escape physical, mental, or emotional abuse. So unfortunately, we know a lot of those risk factors are just really common for our community, and it then does lead into these response behaviors that put them at risk.
Absolutely. Mikayla, did you have anything you wanted to add there? Okay, perfect. So that kind of just moves right into our next topic. So whether it be through running away or kicked out of your home, a disproportionate number of houseless youth self-identify as members of the LGBTQIA community, like John was talking about. Again, it's somewhere around 40% of those who are in shelters or not having a home at the moment identify as members of that community. And we know that that's probably lower than the actuality because of the self-report factor. Mikayla, can you start us off by talking about your experiences working that lack of stable housing acts as a barrier to recovery for survivors?
Definitely. Yeah, so for the youth and the young adults, like I said, we work with 10 to 24-year-olds. So for the youth and the young adults that we work with here in the Sun Coast region with More to Life, housing stability in any scenario is just a major, major factor for overall development, security, being able to ultimately thrive as an individual, and especially these teens who are survivors of severe trauma and sexual abuse. But on top of that instability and trauma experience, the LGBTQ plus youth that we're dealing with, like, they have their own personal identity discovery regarding their gender, their sexuality, and they need that safe place to just say, I need someone to support me and see me and allow me that time and space to just really discover who I am and accept me where I'm at. And so with that, the stability and support from peers and family and mentors, it's crucial during this time in their lives. So without that housing stability from families, from the local community, local organizations, there is a much higher likelihood of seeing them, as Taylor mentioned earlier, running from something or running to something and seeking approval and safety from those who aren't safe. And so for us, we work primarily in a safe home here for young boys, and we've seen them run towards gaming. It doesn't even need to be a stable housing. They're running towards gaming, dating apps, popular social media apps to find someone to provide that stability in that home. So, and I know that leads us to talking about, Lauren, I'll let you kind of lead into the next topic there.
That leads really well. Before I hop over, John, Taylor, did you want to add anything in that realm? We kind of talked about a lot of this already in your earlier points.
I do want to add that for housing too, there's not really data that is shown to prioritize LGBTQ youth, right, or LGBTQ people in general. And so there's not a lot of places that are putting equity for. We know that number is almost half of LGBTQ youth are homeless, but we're not seeing half of our efforts intentionally being put into reaching this population. And so, we think of shelters as being the gatekeepers to getting you into affordable or supportive housing. And most LGBTQ youth don't feel safe staying in shelters. And so a lot of them are on couches and are kind of that hidden youth population that we don't see. And so a lot of kids are actually missing that key step of being prioritized, having an assessment or a BI-SPEDAT to then lead them into that affordable housing.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point, Taylor. And I think I want everyone to kind of keep that in mind as we move throughout the rest of our discussion, because it's really going to become important to keep that in mind as we talk about service gaps moving forward. So put a pin in that as you're listening to the rest of their conversation, y'all. But as Mikayla said, this really moves into our next part of stability and interpersonal relationships. Well, that one of the lesser discussed forms of exploitation, and particularly for those with unstable or combative living environments, that is really predominant among LGBTQIA plus youth, is the concept of survival sex. And for those of you who are not familiar with what survival sex is, or may not understand the full concept of it, it's typically situations where individuals have sex as a means to obtain necessities, like housing, food, transportation, but really anything that is considered necessary for survival, and they're trading sex or sexual favors for that interaction point. So with all the vulnerabilities we talked, the need for stable housing, the need to really process through this identity discovery in a safe place, it really shouldn't be a surprise at this point that LGBTQIA plus youth and young adults are particularly at risk for this form of exploitation. And currently, survival sex does not meet the criteria for commercial sexploitation or sex trafficking. It's kind of that unknown gray area. How do you think this plays into the challenges we face helping gay and transgender youth and young adults process their victimization and then really kind of come to terms with their status as a survivor? I want to open the floor up to every one of you for this. I think every one of you has a unique lens to kind of talk about your perspective in this topic.
I'll start and just say, I think the sort of policy failure to recognize survival sex as a form of commercial sexual exploitation is a huge barrier in just getting our lawmakers to think about how to solve and approach some of these issues. I see, from my perspective in the legislature, a lot of sort of blaming folks for their circumstances based on assumptions. I see it in some of our work around people with HIV as well. And that while they often won't automatically say it, there's sort of an assumption that, well, if somebody's living with HIV, they did something wrong to put themselves in this circumstance and it's sort of their fault, and they're sort of less deserving of support because of that. And then when you bring in an advocate who says, you know, I'm living with HIV because I was born with HIV, and it sort of removes some of that assumed prejudice about somebody just having been in the wrong circumstance and done something wrong to sort of bring this harm upon themselves, then sometimes it makes folks a little more, I think, willing to empathize with them and see the harm that they're suffering, the trauma that they're in, and be willing to take some proactive action. And I think you can see that in this space as well, where you may have policymakers looking at somebody engaging in survival sex and really stigmatizing them for that and being much less willing to offer support and the sort of resources that could help them transition away from that because of these, you know, assumptions about how they got into that circumstance and sort of this knee-jerk reaction to place blame somewhere.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I think that is a huge gap in policy that is something that people don't always necessarily think about until it affects them. So I really appreciate your perspective on that. Taylor, Mikayla, your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's quite a few sex worker collectives that are stepping away from the term survival sex because recognizing that all work is for survival to a degree, and that it invalidates sex work as actual work. And so there's a lot of folks who are kind of stepping away from that and hoping for separating human trafficking from sex work and not putting the two together. And so with that in mind, I think that I would say it's important, especially for the LGBTQ plus population, thinking of Black trans women, that we recognize that people have complex identities and that we're living in a system that is not set up to support trans women, Black trans women, to have jobs that are going to pay them, but to have jobs that are stable to support them. And so we need to focus on things like the victim's compensation, allowing for sex workers who are sexually assaulted to have that access to that care. And we need to focus on having policies that protect sex workers so that they can go to the police for support, so that they can have an indoor sex work job as opposed to being more vulnerable out on the streets. So I just wanted to note that.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I really appreciate that. And Mikayla, I'm going to round out this conversation with you.
Yeah, there is a lot of gray area for sure. the hard part with us that we see, large portion of mentees that we work with, we call our the youth that we work with mentees, not clients or victims, but that age between 14 and 17, they're not a legal adult, they're not seen as making that decision of saying, well, I want to be a sex worker until they turn 18. So between the ages of 14 and 17, they're still a minor, they're extremely vulnerable, but because of past sexual trauma that has happened to them, some of them say, well, this is all I know how to do. And I'm not old enough to get a job, or I might have a criminal record that is a barrier for me getting a normal job like what I would want to do. So there's just so many, it's very multifaceted when it comes to survival sex. And yeah, it's a heavy topic to deal with, but obviously what we always do and what we always, kind of say to our team is we have to meet them where they're at in that moment. And Lauren, as you said earlier, there's just so many layers to it, and kind of getting through those layers to see, well, why is this behavior happening? Why is this lifestyle happening? Let's go deeper as to why and process that first.
Thank you all. And I, again, this is a very short introduction to a very complex topic that has a lot of facets and a lot of layers, and really needs to be driven by the voices of those who are experiencing it. So I definitely recommend, if this is something that you want to delve more into, keep reach out to us as panelists or as the discussion topics. We're more than happy to kind of delve a little bit more intricately, I believe, with you all. Before we move on to the next topic area, though, we did have a kind of comment question in the chat, and I kind of want to direct this at you, Taylor, because I think you have the most relevant topic to it, but feel free, anyone, to answer at all times. They mentioned that some of them are experiencing pushback as people who work with survivors, but also are advocates for supporting sex workers' rights. Do you have any thoughts about that, or any words you can give them?
Yeah, I float between system-led and systemless activism all the time. And, we have to hold multiple truths of the funding pays for this, and our funders say that we have to abide by this. And then also, an urgency and dedication to the people who are actually there to serve, and realizing their identities, their situations. And it all goes to wanting to create a whole community where anybody can walk into a place and have a livable wage, can have a job, can have the huge world of choices that increases with however much privilege you have. But that's not where we currently are. And so we do have to kind of recognize that the crutch and the issue isn't the way that you survive, which could be sex work. The issue is that you have minimal options out there. And so what I, what I used to do at the drop-in center for homeless youth is we would have Narcan, we would have condoms, we would have Plan B and strips to test fentanyl, and all of these harm reduction things there. We would have trucks that came by and did STD testing. And so we would just set up spaces that made it safe for people to be there without really stepping into the decriminalization versus not decriminalization. But we would make services specific to making it a little bit safer with what you had. We would have classes for, if you're stripping, how do you do your taxes, right? And then that would speak to kids, and they would say, oh, I never thought of that. Or we would have, we had nightly, every Thursday night, a sex worker support group where the kids would get together and they would say, I'm going to call you when I go to this house, and you're going to make sure that I leave safely. And of course, in my heart of hearts, I would never want that to have to be an option for somebody. But if it is, I realize that's part of their identity, and I need to make it safer until there's something else for them. And so I think it just goes to realizing where people are at and genuinely affirming and accepting them with what their complex identity has created or what it is. Mm-hmm.
And I think that really ties in general with both working with survivors and working with LGBTQIA youth in general, is that our systems are not perfect right now. That's why we all fight to change them from our different lenses. And in the meantime, we still have to work within them to provide services for people. So I really think that's such a crucial component to consider, especially as we move into kind of talking about some more institutional or bigger picture questions here. Specifically that, the prevalence and the ways that violence and victimization impacts LGBTQIA plus individuals in general. We know that this community is at higher risk for victimization, at higher risk for violence, especially sexual violence perpetrated against them because of their identity typically, particularly bisexual women and transgender women. They are at the highest prevalence rate for violence and victimization committed against them. And a lot of the times it is related to their sexuality or gender status. And what do we think are some ways that we can work to provide these additional protections to these groups, knowing that they are at higher risk, that the data does support that they are being victimized more prevalently in this arena? Open to anyone, but I think we all have, again, great lenses to talk about this question.
I'll say for Equality Florida's perspective, this is an issue that we focus on a lot. I mean, we know there are shockingly disproportionate rates of victimization and harm brought upon our transgender and gender nonconforming communities. Last year, the Human Rights Campaign counted 44 fatalities within the community, which is the highest on record since they've started counting nationally in 2013. And that includes cases in Florida. Florida actually has an incredible shameful legacy of 7 murders of Black, transgender, and gender nonconforming women in just a 2-year period. So there's a lot that we can do to try to address some of these incredible gaps that we have in services that are leading to some of this harm. I don't think it's a purely policy approach that can get us out of this. But there's legislation out there, things that Capital T and other organizations have supported, along with Equality Florida, like closing loopholes in Florida's existing hate crimes law. Right now, there is no provision for addressing crimes of bias based on gender identity. So even when motives are clear, again, there is no sort of enhanced protection for our transgender community. And we know that the lack of those protections creates sort of a self-fulfilling cycle where there's less trust within those communities and less willingness to report violence because they know that there isn't a specific recourse there. And that makes everybody less safe. So there's, I think, a really broad community interest in addressing some of those issues, like the gaps in our hate crimes law. That's sort of a bigger state policy issue, but even locally, I think when you look at things like having liaisons in police departments that are an LGBTQ plus liaison who has more cultural competency, again, that can help build community trust to help improve safety for everyone. So again, not sort of a panacea or something that's going to solve all of these issues, but there are a number of steps that we can take to address where we see these sort of harms occurring in our communities.
Absolutely. And I think the concept of lack of trust to the systems that are supposed to be providing support is one of those really crucial barriers that we have to overcome as service providers, as members of support systems, as policymakers, to help bridge that gap. And I definitely want to talk to Mikayla and Taylor about this with their work in the field and seeing their perspective about how these lack of trusts have really impacted and been a barrier to providing services to survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking, particularly in this community.
Yeah, I will say that that is a huge barrier when there is that lack of trust from the youth, from a young adult, that they have experienced sexual trauma or aggression or disproportionate services from organizations, from law enforcement, from politicians, people who are supposed to be the trustworthy people, from faith-based people. When they have added to the issue, there's going to be less trust there and less opportunity to then have a safe place or a safe person to go to. That's why at More to Life, I've seen one of the biggest things that has broken down barriers is that we provide survivor mentors to each of our mentees. And that is a person who they're coming in and saying, hey, I'm a survivor. I know what you're going through, instead of just saying, oh, I can't imagine, or I'm trying to understand, but I can't. There's just something there that's different when it truly is a survivor that can say, I've been there, I know what you're going through, and we're going to get through this together, and kind of show them that example. So that has been fantastic in the work. I can't promote survivor-led interventions and organizations enough after seeing what I've seen in the field for 2.5 years. But yeah, there's a definite lack of education and awareness as well. I'm going to touch on that later because I can go on and on about education, when it comes to how that is going to help us move forward as a society, to help, like what John was saying, with the cultural competencies, and to know what it is to have intersectionalities within the LGBTQIA+ community. So.
Absolutely. And Taylor, I know you have a lot of experience in this realm as well. So I want to kind of round it out with your comments on this topic.
Yeah, and first, just finger snaps to Mikayla and John Harris, because I absolutely agree with what both of you said. And then just adding that we recognize when someone is trafficked or sexually assaulted, and they're part of the LGBTQ+ community, there are so many services that they need to interact with. You know, law enforcement, sometimes there's Baker Acts, there's mental health, there's services just to get you kind of back on your feet into housing. And each one of those spaces has a likelihood of not being affirming and accepting. And I've done years and years of trainings on, you know, bring us in for the LGBTQ 101, and this is a pronoun, and this is that. And so many times just for one staff to mess it up, you know, and then for that youth to no longer use that service and be out on their own. Or if you're in a shelter, you know, you can have the best direct care staff, the best leadership team, but you can't control how other clients are going to treat a youth when they go in there. And so, you know, young folks, LGBTQ folks are just facing all these interventions that we've set up that are missing the mark for them. They're not affirming, and they're not safe. And so youth aren't using them. And so that's part of the work, is how do I make every avenue that a young person is going to interact with completely affirming and safe? And if it's not, then I need to rethink that entire system that we're counting on and leaning on, and not just say, oh, well, this kid doesn't want to come, because there's a reason why they're not coming. And the issue isn't that the youth isn't going there, it's that the service isn't working, right? If it's not working for everybody, for your most marginalized and historically oppressed clients, then it's not working. And so that's what I think we have to keep in mind, is how do we secure every intervention or get new interventions, right?
I think that is the crucial part there is, you know, how can we make sure that our interventions are being tested, that they work with this population, that they work with survivors of trafficking. As we all know, there's a lot of overlap in sexual violence and a lot of overlap in trafficking, but they are not the same problem. They are not the same experience. They have interacting points, but just because something is successful with survivors of one victimization does not mean it will work with survivors of trafficking. Much like just because something works with your heteronormative population definitely does not mean that it's going to work with individuals who are experiencing identity challenges, like discovering your sexual identity, discovering your gender identity. So I really think that is such a crucial point to consider in all avenues of service provision and policymaking, not just this arena, but particularly this arena. And that ties really well into a question we have from the audience, that we have a number of state laws that have been coming out that are meant to protect the baseline, protect the social group in power, especially, you know, right now based on gender identity. And in terms of sports, community engagement, what services are available for our members of the community who are transgender. How do you think this plays into a factor, seeing these policy decisions made and their willingness to trust community services provided by the same source?
Well, I'll jump in here. I think these are hugely problematic. It's something that we've fought for months in the state legislature in Florida, but as the commenter noted, I mean, part of a nationally organized campaign. We've seen these anti-trans youth bills filed in 30 states this year. Florida's unfortunately and shamefully did pass this legislative session. It has been signed by the governor. And while legal challenges are very much expected soon, is going into effect. And it sends an incredibly harmful and damaging message to the young people who are impacted by it and really around the state. I mean, it is explicitly othering our transgender and gender nonconforming youth, and telling their peers that this group and this population should be treated separately and shouldn't be allowed to play, you know, on the teams with their friends and learn those incredibly important life lessons that come from playing a sport or being part of a team, that sort of leadership and teamwork. And so we have a Safe and Healthy Schools program in Equality Florida that does a lot of work with school districts and school administration to really provide some of that LGBTQ cultural competency, because we know schools are such important safe spaces for some of our LGBTQ plus youth. In fact, for most LGBTQ plus youth, the first place they'll come out is online to friends. The second place is at school, and then it is to a parent in the home. So we need supportive environments, and using this apparatus now of having schools kick kids off of teams that they're currently playing on is so damaging, not just, again, for the opportunities for those individual kids, but the message that it sends to everybody in the system who is seeing yet another place where the government is now telling you that it is okay to deprive transgender youth of the same opportunities that we give everybody else. And then you have incidents like we recently saw in Deerfield Beach, Florida, with a young kid, I think in middle school, being beaten in the hallway because of their gender identity. And the only reason we know about it is because somebody caught it on a cell phone on camera. But these events are just far too frequent. I mean, any one would be too frequent, but they are reinforced by incredibly harmful policy decisions like this that are just about, you know, providing, I would say, red meat to an extremist base, and they are not about addressing any sort of policy problem, because we've had policies on transgender student athlete participation in place for nearly a decade with 0 reported complaints.
Thank you for that, John. And I kind of figured that was going to be when you were going to hop right on. Before we move on to the next topic, because I think it really ties into that nice concept of not providing those safe spaces and how that impacts the entryway into trafficking, I wanted to see if Mikayla, you or Taylor wanted to follow up on that point. Cool. All right. So the next topic we're going to talk about again is that regardless of the sex or gender of the victim, most individuals who participate on the supply side of trafficking identify as men. Not all, but most. Subsequently, interpersonal relationships are one of the most prominent entry points into the commercial exploitation of children, specifically. Trafficking as well, but especially at that younger entry point into exploitation. What relationship do you think this information has, knowing all of these lack of safe spaces and lack of belonging that some of our youth go through in terms of when they're discovering their identity? What relationship do you think these factors have in terms of the disproportionate exploitation of male victims and those who are assigned male at birth, regardless of their sexual identity? Mikayla, it looks like you might be looking to
I mean, I can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of like touched on it a little bit earlier, which I can go into a bit deeper with gaming, right? And really developing those relationships online, because nowadays people don't understand, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, is making our community aware how trafficking looks different in the US than it does overseas. It's starting to look similar overseas now with technology, but in the US, this is our biggest thing, is the phone. The phone, the PlayStation 4, the gaming systems that go online. And when these youth, extremely vulnerable youth, are going on these gaming systems and they're building these relationships, these trusted relationships and friendships where they can open up to someone, they can seek that approval, that affirmation that they're not getting at home, that they're not getting from foster parents, that they're not getting from the shelter that they're in. And they can develop this very intimate online relationship with someone. And then what the FBI has now coined it as is the sexploitation, is that, hey, send me a photo, I'll send you a photo. Now that I have all of this on you, here's what I'm going to do if you don't do X, Y, and Z. So we have come across that quite a bit, and it's common gaming. Fortnite, Minecraft, Snapchat, TikTok, all of these very, very common everyday apps and games that parents or guardians or mentors think that are safe, but they're not. And that's where the relationship develops. That's where the myth of, oh, it's kidnapping, I'm not going to let my child just walk down the street alone because something's going to happen. It's like, actually, you probably shouldn't leave them in their room alone with their phone for too long without monitoring it, because that's when the relationships develop. That's when they are seeking that attention or approval or affirmation from someone else who may not be a safe person. And then in particular to the LGBTQ youth and to that community, as John touched on earlier, where are they they're coming out first online to possibly a stranger, to someone that they've developed a relationship with on a gaming system who they think is their age, but it's actually someone who's twice their age in a different state. So these are where those vulnerabilities really, really come into play, and that traffickers and people who want to prey on those vulnerabilities are taking advantage.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mikayla. That is, it's a lot of information people don't necessarily think about unless they work in the realm. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Taylor, John, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add that, Florida and a lot of states don't do a good job of talking about sex ed and healthy relationships and consent in general, much less also talking about LGBTQ specific consent and sex ed and all of this. So it's, kids are out there on their own, and the people who are willing to talk to them about it aren't always the safest person. And so, that's something that's going to be hard for us until we can say, let's talk about sex, let's talk about sex positivity, let's talk about LGBTQ folks who are having sex, and like make specific, open spaces for everybody to have communication about what consent is and healthy relationships are. Otherwise, they're getting that information somewhere else, like Mikayla was saying, someone else is going to reach out to them.
Well, I think that ties really well into that discussion as a policy opportunity, John. I think that's sex ed is always a touchy topic, especially in areas that are not nearly as progressive in that arena, and a lack of modeling relationships that look like the ones they're going to be heading into. It is a hard part of that. Do you want to touch on that a little bit, John?
Sure. I'll just say, for context, in Florida, we have now for a long time had an opt-out of sex ed opportunity for parents or guardians of youth in the school system. This past legislative session, there was a big effort to try to change that to a specific opt-in, which would, again, of course, limit the access to that information for so many more young folks. Again, not just those whose parents might not be supportive of it, but those who may not have a parent, at home, or who's paying enough attention when, the permission slip comes through for sex ed. And we know that, as Taylor said, if they're not getting that information in school, it's not that they're just not going to get it, but they may get it from the wrong sources, medically inaccurate sources, or more dangerous sources. And so it remains a really critical sort of battle line in Florida politics, and I'm sure in a lot of states, and something that I think we're going to continue to see a lot of pressure around. I mean, Florida still requires to sort of teach the virtues of abstinence, and I think there are a lot of materials in that sex ed curriculum that probably don't have strong empirical bases for reducing things like STDs, STIs, teen pregnancies that we have concerns about when it comes to sex ed. But I think we see a big disconnect between, again, some of the proven policies and education materials there and what is in fact in our curriculum now.
Thank you so much for that. I greatly appreciate your insight on that. I kind of wanted to tie a lot of our conversations about trust, about these programs we're looking to provide specifically for this population or that intersect with this population. A lot of us recognize the mandatory reporting status, and that trafficking is an element of that needs to be reported to DCF. In these spaces where there's challenges and you suspect a minor being trafficked in a non-trafficking program, what are your recommended steps in terms of that reporting aspect? I know, Mikayla, you work primarily with survivors, so you want to talk about how this referral kind of works out for you all?
Can you kind of restate that again as far as reporting and
So the question was asking the issue of mandatory reporting to DCF if, as a provider, you suspect a minor is being trafficked. We know that the trust is a huge part of working with survivors, and that with our challenges with system trust, how do we reconcile reporting this to DCF, but also maintaining that trust level with our client or our survivor?
Yeah, it's difficult, but especially with a minor, just being open and honest with them and saying, listen, we're here because we're concerned and we love you. We're meeting you where you're at. Definitely, we always ask whenever we have a referral coming in if the HT screening tool has been conducted, if they are HTC-SEC verified, commercially sexually exploited children. So just making sure that we understand when we start with a mentee where we're meeting them at and what needs to be done from there. And it really is, I'll be honest, it's case by case basis. Sometimes we're partnering with the parents, with the foster parents, with the facility that they're at to help guide them through that process. And typically we're helping to guide someone else to do that reporting, since we are not, a legal guardian. But yeah, it's difficult because it really is case by case basis. But like I said, having open and honest conversations with youth specifically, that we're here for them first and foremost, and but we're here ultimately to help protect them as well for what they want.
Thank you. Taylor, yeah.
I mean, just a bit tangential, excuse me, but a lot of this talk about reporting came up this past legislative session in Florida, and really in the context of schools and the issue of whether school teachers and counselors have to out LGBTQ youth to their parents. I want to make it very clear, there is no existing trigger in law, either before the session or past this session, that says that teachers, school guidance counselors, whatever, have to pick up the phone and call parents and notify them if they learn something about a student's sexual orientation or gender identity. And on the flip side, there are some requirements around disclosure of records that schools have on students that they do have to share with those parents. But Equality Florida's concerns, and a concern shared by many, was that there is not flexibility in our statutes around where disclosing that information could subject young folks to harm. Certainly, we wish that every young person came from a safe and supportive environment, but we know that's not the case for all of our young people. And there is, again, sort of no discretion for where disclosure of information could really jeopardize a young person and put them at grave risk. I have stood in front of a lawmaker who told me, from the committee bench, I can't imagine any two people who would love somebody less in the world than their own kid. That's got to just be the strongest relationship that you could ever have, and they would always act in their best interest 100% of the time. But again, we know that's not the case. And so I think there are real challenges there when you talk about issues like reporting and that disclosure of information and building that trust that's so important.
And if I can jump on that real quick, I love what John just touched on there, because it's so true of this misconception of, well, it's their parent. This is their child. Of course, they love them unconditionally. They'll do anything for them. And that's when we come in and say, have you heard of familial sex trafficking ever? Because so many people can't even fathom that that's a thing. And in that sense, a lot of times we see it as parents are using their child as a survival sex. We can go, going back into that. But the parent says, I need to make money for my addiction. I need to make money to pay rent. I have a 14-year-old daughter. I have a 15-year-old son. Familial trafficking. So that right there is showing and teaching lawmakers, policymakers, people in our community that this is real. This happens every day. And the sooner we're aware of it, we can start to create policies that help support these youth and to show, there is, just because a child comes from a certain household doesn't mean it's this perfect, beautiful nuclear family behind closed doors. And we need to realize that more and more to support the youth and what they're going through in their trauma.
Thank you so much, Mikayla and John. Taylor, did you want to add anything before we move on?
No, I think they did a great job, just that saying again that protections really shouldn't be left up to an individual to decide. That's kind of where we get some of these surprise policy changes with school boards that, youth only find out about when they get home and then they're kicked out. So, yeah, I agree with what everyone said.
Well, we definitely touched on the surface of a lot of these topics. Again, these all go very deep into the iceberg here. I kind of wanted to move on. We are moving very well through this into talking about service gaps. And we touched a little bit on this, but this is a huge issue, particularly for LGBTQIA+ individuals, whether it be exclusion or the services just not existing for their needs. And I wanted to start off with talking about how, because there is limited resources of the public sector, faith-based organizations are the largest group of non-government funded providers of service in the United States. There has been a lot of ground in reconciling, especially recent years, with certain major church and other religious affiliations moving towards inclusivity in their individual churches or at the organizational level. But there is still very much a exclusion aspect in this realm. Especially for those in same-sex partnerships or may present in a different gender than what they're assigned. Mikayla, I'd really like to start with you in talking about how this really is a challenge for our LGBTQIA survivors and how this impacts them.
Absolutely. This is something that gets me going for sure, because I have to say I am from a faith-based background, and I think there is a lot lacking there. There's a lot of pain there that the church and faith-based organizations have not reconciled and come forward and just kind of stated, where they have gone wrong and what they could be doing better. But before I get too deep into that, kind of what you were saying is that due to a lot of these partners being faith-based, it has always been a bit difficult to navigate. Now that I am in an organization that we're just trying to find resources, we're trying to find places that will support all of our mentees, but then navigating that piece of the LGBTQ plus, all of our mentees that identify in that community, because these faith-based organizations, they want to donate, they do want to help survivors of human trafficking, but the contingency sometimes may be, well, we want to donate Bibles. Well, we want to make these care packages, and within this care package, we're going to put a note that has some scripture on it, or it may say, something very, very specific that could trigger a mentee because of their relationship and their past with the church or with a faith-based organization. So it's just things like that that we need to educate faith-based organizations of, hey, this is great if you want to step up, if you want to help, if you want to donate and provide resources, but it needs to be safe, it needs to be barrier-free, it needs to be non-triggering and non-re-traumatizing for these youth, especially of the LGBTQ plus community. So, and with that, not only when it comes to these resources, but kind of going back to the housing piece, right? That there is a barrier with safe houses that are faith-based, which quite a few are. Many of these shelters are safe homes. They, their messaging can be very triggering. As Taylor kind of touched on, it's like they might not even want to go to that safe house because they know they have to attend a weekly Bible study or they have to go to church on Sunday. A lot of these, faith-based nonprofits and shelters, they won't allow these LGBTQ plus, what's the word I'm looking for? Like services to come into the home, because we've had mentees specifically, they identify as non-binary, they identify as trans, and we want to get services because sometimes it's harder to get them out of the home. We want those services to go into the home, and because of beliefs, because of the rules in their home, they're not allowed. So it's difficult to navigate that for sure in the field. That's something that we've kind of come across. And for me, I've always wanted to just educate and provide knowledge, because for the healing process to even begin, they need to feel safe. And if they're in a home where they don't feel safe, they don't feel accepted, then they can't even begin the healing process at all. So that's where it all begins. So yeah, just kind of breaking down that barrier that there is nothing wrong with them, that they, just because they don't believe in something, and they're not, they want to practice something different than what is being preached at them. It needs to be okay for them to practice what they want to practice and believe in what they want to believe in.
Thank you so much, Mikayla. John?
I certainly co-sign everything that Mikayla just said, and just wanted to add a footnote. We are expecting probably within about the next 2 weeks what could be a really important decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. This is the Fulton County versus City of Philadelphia case, and looking at Catholic social services and their policies around not dealing with same-sex couples when it comes to foster and adoption placements. And there could be really wide ramifications there about, again, where these boundaries are for faith-based organizations to deny somebody service, whether it is because of an LGBTQ plus identity or just, saying we don't want to work with mixed faith couples or, with a single mom when it comes to foster and adoption placement. So a lot of uncertainty about where that will go, but it could be an area that we see a lot of changes in the near future.
Perfect. Taylor, did you want to add anything to that topic?
Yeah, just that there are still lots of LGBTQ kids who want to have a connection to their religion and their spirituality. And there are lots of churches where most of the people are affirming and accepting and welcoming. And we have some great ones here in Tallahassee. And so, I feel like it doesn't have to be you're gay or you're or you are religious, right? You can have both. You can have an amazing community. This is coming from a heathen, so but still you can. And finding that for youth and for families, saying let's find you a church that will welcome you as you are, could be very powerful, because people are incredibly connected to their spirituality and could be a great intervention for the whole family.
I wholeheartedly agree there. Just because you love someone or are attracted to someone who is of the same gender or of the same sex as you does not mean that you cannot find a connection with the spirituality. And I think that's something that is shifting the narrative and is shifting in the stigmatization as we move forward. And I appreciate the conversations here about what our next steps are looking down this route. So it kind of overlaps with what we're talking about next, in terms of, again, that there are a lot of barriers to a lot of these, especially sexual violence or victimization services. A lot of the times they're restricted based on sex and or gender. This is really, really challenging for transgender women and men and those who identify as non-binary or agender. In the realm of gender-based violence, it is absolutely common practice to kind of keep things separate based on gender. It leads to a severe gap for survivors who are not heterosexual cisgender women. Since many of these organizations, programs are at least partially funded by public money, is this something you consider a public policy oversight? And I kind of want to start this with John, but we can definitely evolve this conversation into your other specific areas of knowledge.
Yeah, I think this is an important question, and indicative of a lot of the policy debates that we have around sex and gender identity. And to me, it harkens back to the battles that we have fought a lot and may still yet fight around things like bathroom access. But shelter access in general, we've seen at the federal level be somewhat of a political football in recent years, where you had positive moves by the Obama administration and then attempts to roll that back under the last Trump administration, where homeless shelters would be able to turn away transgender folks from single-sex facilities that match their gender identity. And now you have the Biden administration coming back and saying that they are ending any efforts to undermine and roll back that rule, thankfully. But it does remain, I think, a common policy challenge and point of discussion, where we're focused far too myopically on what is between somebody's legs, instead of looking at the issues of what policies are in place. If your concern is something like sexual violence, do you in fact have statutes around assault and battery? It shouldn't be coming down to, again, somebody's physical anatomy. There are appropriate protections and policies that we can have in place, and in virtually all cases do already have in place, that address these sort of fears and the boogeymen that are continually, pulled out of the closet, no pun intended, when we have these conversations around quote unquote single sex facilities.
Perfect. Taylor, do you have anything you wanted to add in that realm?
Just that, sometimes policies they're gonna shift, and then we're gonna have 4 years of them harming people, and then they'll shift back and the pendulum just swings at the expense of the people who are passing through those services. But there are things that we can do as individuals on the ground to make it safer. And, something in town that we did is we went to our COC and we said, hey, they're saying that you can discriminate against trans people coming into shelters. What can we do on an individual level here in town? And so doing that work of what are our own policies internally at each of these organizations and who needs training. And so just like making little cracks in this whole system that will hopefully, make it so that the bigger policies don't happen as often, because we've done the groundwork to educate and to create a whole community in our own areas, which will feed into the larger policy work. But not just saying, oh, the policy is this, but saying, what can I do individually in my community where I hold power that can make it a little bit safer for folks? I think it's important.
Thank you so much. That is absolutely one of the most crucial ways we can start building that brick by brick versus trying to, build a whole structure at once. So that's a great approach for all of this work we do. Mikayla, before we move on, did you want to add anything in that realm? Okay, perfect. So we're going to kind of move into the last question on this like service gap area. And we touched a little bit on this when we talked about sex education in schools, but in general, outreach materials are often designed to reach the largest audience in need and frequently neglects our most vulnerable individuals, especially those with overlapping and intersectional identities. Taylor, let's begin with you. And can you talk a little bit about how this is harmful to those who aren't represented, particularly youth and young adults who identify as LGBTQIA+.
Sure. Well, first, visibility without protections is a trap. And so your first step isn't to put a rainbow flag on a flyer and, a trans person in an ad for your organization. Your first step is to do the internal work of how is my organization safe and what's the grievance policy and the accountability and how am I rechecking in to make sure it's continuously staying safe. And so we want to sometimes start with Pride Month. Let's put up a post so everyone knows we're safe. We really have to do that background work before we announce everything is great. But on the flip side of that, it's so important to see yourself. It's to see yourself represented in a space, on a flyer even, or in conversation, to see yourself on an intake sheet when they ask you something that refers to your identity, or they don't whisper the word trans or trip over a pronoun. So, it's all connected of how comfortable are you. And when I used to do presentations, I would get people to just scream the words gay and trans and queer, because if you whisper that when you're talking to somebody, you're putting a little deviance on it and a kid picks up on that. So there's just so many little parts that we have to get comfortable with and to challenge ourselves with so that people can see themselves in services, but they can also feel safe once they get to those services too. I think it's just so important for youth.
I can see it itching to hop into this conversation, Mikayla. So let's turn it over to you.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement that it can't just start with, let's just make a post and put a rainbow flag on it and say we're inclusive, we're this. Doing that background work for us, I think the big part is partnering with those safe experts in your community first, seeking them out. Who are those people that are the experts in the field and want to work and be that survivor for those mentees? And so locally, we love partnering with Metro Inclusive Health. They are phenomenal. They provide wonderful services down here. And so kind of lifting them up as the champion instead of saying, no, we know it all. No, they know it all and we support them. We partner with them, and lifting up organizations like that, I think, is a really big key factor. Instead of proclaiming that you may be the expert in an area, I think it actually takes more humility to say, we might not be the experts, but we want to learn from them and we want to lift them up. And that's what I've always tried to do in our community, is just say, hey, reach out to Metro, talk to someone there and really dive in and see how you can help within this community more. So that's what I always attempt to do here at More to Life, and push our mentees to say, hey, Metro Inclusive Health or any local organizations that I know they will be safe to reach out to.
I love that idea of, the humility, but also it's all about building support for our survivors at the end of the day, and putting the right people in the right places is the best way to do that. So thank you so much for that, Mikayla. John, did you want to add anything on that topic before we move on?
No, I think that was great. I wrote down Taylor's quote of visibility without protections is a trap. I like that.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Well, we have a lot of really, really excellent questions in the chat that I want to touch on. But before we do, I did kind of want to ask you all as panelists, as we're wrapping up with this conversation, I'd like for each of you to kind of share one thing that you think is most important action item that we, as a group attending this, of providers, policymakers, and community members who are engaged, can do to improve how we provide support to the LGBTQIA plus survivors of sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. We're going to kind of go round robin on this, but John, I'd like to start off with you.
Sure. Well, this is obviously very biased from my work and my lens, but I really think that having conversations with policymakers is incredibly important. Certainly, if you can get up to the Capitol and do something like a Lobby Days event, I know Voices for Florida facilitates a lot of those types of meetings. Equality Florida does as well, but whatever organization you're with, having those conversations is so valuable because it really does put a face on issues and a personal anecdote and experience rather than just, pages of data or white papers that sort of end up in stacks on desks and in files. And we've seen the power of those conversations where somebody said, I've never had a conversation with a transgender person before, or I've never had a conversation with somebody living with HIV before, at least to their knowledge. And it's so much harder to legislate against somebody when you've really been able to see their humanity and understand their story. And I think we're talking about an area, again, where there are so many assumptions made about how folks get into these circumstances and assumptions about sort of fault and wrongdoing, that having those one-on-one conversations or small group conversations really can do the work that helps change hearts and minds. And hopefully that, entails policy change too, but really, I think the changing around hearts and minds and attitude is what is most important. Sometimes the policy comes first, sometimes the policy comes second, but it's those sort of changes that we need.
Thank you. That is something we can all take part in doing moving forward. So I really appreciate that and all of your insight throughout this whole panel. Taylor, Mikayla, do either of you want to hop on next?
Sure, I can. So I would just say get in better relationship with one another, make pockets of humanity with the people around you and noting where you hold power and how can you connect on a storytelling personal level with someone is just so important. And not to stop at just LGBTQ, but also recognizing intersectionality and that all oppression is connected and racism and sexism and everything is xenophobia is so connected. And so to have those pockets of conversation with people is crucial for seeing faces, not just blurbs on the news, right?
Thank you. And Mikayla, I want to kind of round off our action items with you.
Yes, wonderful. So kind of what I stated earlier that I really wanted to just drive home with this is education, 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 right? So one of the most important action items that I can't stress enough while engaging with the current LGBTQ plus community is to be aware of what's happening every day in our society. Educate yourself on the language and being used to how to properly address people, especially in our field. It's never good enough to just say, well, it's changing too fast. I can't keep up with it all. So I'm just not even going to try. But once we stop learning and developing our knowledge based on this issue, we give up ever truly helping and making a difference, right? So in order to gain that trust and respect, we must show it first. And that starts with appropriate language and respect for what they are going through. Because honestly, Lauren, when we're meeting with a mentee, I have found that they don't need you to get it. They want you to see it and to acknowledge it. That's what they want more than anything. That it's saying, can you just be with me in this moment and see this current struggle that I'm going through and just see it? So when it comes down to it, it really is just that respect, that trust, and educating ourselves and just be willing to learn every single day.
I think that willingness to learn is one of the most crucial things that we as people who work with vulnerable individuals can do. I have a professor who used to say that cultural competency is not enough, that cultural humility is the important factor, that commitment to learning and that commitment to constantly growing, even if it's something that you may identify as part of the community, we always can grow. We can always learn. So I really appreciate that insight, Mikayla. I did want to take some time before we head out. This is a great time to kind of wrap up any other additional questions. I have one I want to kind of touch base on from the audience. And it's asking specifically, what has Florida done to recognize and count LGBTQ survivors? And they specifically asked when it comes to VOCA funds, but in general, with like government and public funding, is there something that we know of that they're doing to make sure that we're including these individuals in our outreach, or is it something that is a gap in how we allocate funds as a state? Someone want to hop in on that one?
So VOCA, they do have specific funding for underserved populations, as we know, and they do try to highlight and prioritize when we do focus on LGBTQ populations, but there's always more we can do. And I think there's a fine line of prioritizing, but then also just separating from all the work that we're actually doing and kind of doing it as an afterthought. So I think they are doing, trying to move in the right direction, but it's the pendulum of who's over the whole program.
I agree. And I think it's one of those things where we want to create safe spaces and but we also want to create inclusive spaces where they're not being othered as a protective factor. And that's a really hard balance to strike, because you want that safety, but you also want to make sure that they know that they're part of society, that they are a human just like the rest of us. And we all have different factors that make us unique in different ways. So I think that's a really great point, Taylor. Mikayla or John?
I can just say from a data point that the Open Doors Outreach Network is doing a phenomenal job just now tracking anyone who identifies as LGBTQ+ within the sex trafficking community, human trafficking community, to help fill those gaps and those barriers and services even more for their benefit and for our mentees' benefit, all in all. So it's just great to see more data coming from that, so I really want to lift up the Open Doors Outreach Network and for all that you all are doing with that VOCA funding.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we have a lot of really great questions in here, so I apologize you all if we don't get to them. We are running a little low on time at this point, but there was a question in the audience about kind of tying all the way back to the start about homelessness, houselessness, and the runaway factor. And if we're aware of any runaway prevention or intervention programs that are addressing the root causes we're talking about of running away or running to something versus just the symptomatic side.
Yeah, there's an intervention called the family reunification. And if you go to Point Source Youth, they are youth-led, LGBTQ-led, people of color-led, specifically Black, queer, youth-led, national nonprofit that does a lot of cool interventions like host homes, which eliminates the need for shelters and puts people in individual housing and communities that link with their identities. And they have the interventions of rapid rehousing, as well as direct cash transfers, which is really exciting, of get out of the way of young folks, give them money every month and watch what they do. And the data has shown they pay their rent, they pay for food, they go to work. And so just looking at Point Source Youth and some of their interventions, there's some really cool things where we just let youth take the reins and we let them kind of design what they need to get out of homelessness or exploitation. And so family reunification is a really big one where they want help connecting the family together, kind of like a P-flag style of just let's try and create a whole safe space back at home.
Thank you for that. I figured you would probably have a resource for them in terms of a good route to take on that. I did want to say that there was a individual in the audience who sent a question, but they wanted to tie in, especially some of the technology pieces that Mikayla was talking about, that the Florida Prosecuting Attorneys Association and the Florida Network of Children's Advocacy Centers is hosting a symposium on stopping technology facilitated abuse of rural kids. So I'm not going to go over all the details here just because it's a little lengthy for you all to absorb, but if you do sign up for our email network, we will make sure that that's included in materials and resources that we include as follow-up to this, because I think that's a very, very important resource for us to provide, especially with all the information we talked about today. And it's free, it's not limited to rural circuits, it's just targeted to that population. So thank you so much for bringing that up, Jim. Well, before we head out today, I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for attending. I want to thank the panelists for their time and just incredible insight of lived experience. And I want to thank you all for all of your work you put into this and the work you all do every day in terms of creating safe spaces for our LGBTQIA plus youth and young adults and community members of all ages. And I wanted to also highlight that our next webinar is going to be talking about the topic of victim blaming. We're going to be discussing how this impacts survivors of trafficking and how it impacts the work as a whole and the stigmas associated with that. We are going to be highlighting some of the incredible work that both team members of the Voices team and other partners in our field Open Doors Network are doing. We're going to be also sending out an evaluation form and acknowledgement of attendance via email following this webinar. So if you need that for your training and education credits or anything along those lines, that will be coming. We do really hope that you take the time to fill out this evaluation. The series is something we want to continue growing and want to continue providing topics that are important to you all in the field, whether it be related to individual identities or different factors in the community. We also want to make sure that you are staying connected with us for other opportunities. So we have all of our former webinars on our website, and that's at www.voicesforflorida.org. This webinar will also be posted. So if you have team members and community members who you think could benefit from this, this will be available for upload in the next few days. We are also able to talk more about the Open Doors Outreach Network through that, our community partners like the amazing More to Life that Mikayla is a part of, as well as our other providers throughout the state. You can also sign up to receive updates on trainings, other activities that we'll be doing, educational events, things like that, and stay engaged with us as we create more action items and continue to partner with these amazing organizations like Equality Florida and FCASV and Capital T as they continue to kind of keep growing with us. If anyone else wants to say anything before we head off, panelists, I want to open the floor one last time for you all to kind of say your farewell to the audience as well.
I just say thanks for convening us, Lauren and Voices for Florida, and thanks for everybody for engaging with the questions and the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Happy Pride. Let's keep the momentum going.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I saw that Taylor put her email in the chat. I did so as well. So if you want to keep the conversation going, please feel free to reach out.
I will also do the same. This is obviously a topic that I hold very near and dear to my heart as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community and someone working in this field. So I am always happy to continue if your questions weren't answered the way you'd like, or you want to keep the conversation going. I am more than happy to be a resource moving forward as well, you all. So with that, I want to thank you all again for attending, and I want to really express our gratitude and happy Pride to each and every one of you attending. You all have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your Pride Month.
Thank you.
Thanks.